We don't seat your kind in the main hall. The staff quarters have a perfectly good cafeteria. The words didn't just cut through the low hum of dinner conversation. They detonated, ripping a hole in the gilded atmosphere of the Pinnacle Club. They weren't whispered. They weren't a careless slip. They were delivered with the cold, deliberate precision of an executioner's blade, loud enough for the crystal chandeliers to vibrate with a sudden, sharp silence. At the entrance to the private dining room, a hostess with a name tag that read Tiffany stood as a self-appointed sentinel. Her arm was outstretched, a pale, rigid barrier blocking the path to a grand mahogany table. She had chosen her words as a weapon, each one polished with the smug venom of someone who believed they were defending a sacred kingdom. Every head in the room swiveled. Forks loaded with filet mignon froze inches from parted lips. The easy laughter that had filled the air moments before evaporated, leaving a vacuum of pure, uncut shock. And at the epicenter of this sudden, deafening hush stood a woman in a deep crimson dress. There were no diamonds dripping from her neck, no bodyguards flanking her, no gaudy designer logos screaming for attention. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot, a style that spoke of discipline, not decoration. Her posture was a masterclass in defiance. Her spine did not curve, her shoulders did not flinch. She simply stood there, letting the grotesque cruelty of the hostess's declaration hang in the air, forcing every single person in that room to breathe it in, to taste its bitter, rancid flavor. Before we dive into the storm that's about to break, I have to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. Let us know where this story is reaching. And if you believe that human dignity is non-negotiable, that respect is a right and not a privilege, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button and give this video a powerful thumbs up. You're not just a viewer, you're a witness. Your voice, your like, your subscription. It tells the world that these stories of justice must be heard. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's get back to her. Tiffany, the hostess, tapped a leather-bound menu against her palm, a rhythmic, condescending beat adding a soundtrack to her insult. "This table," she sneered, her eyes raking over the woman's simple crimson dress, "is for our executive partners, real executives." She lingered on the word real as if it were a foreign object in her mouth, something she had to inspect before spitting out. The woman in crimson finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange density, a low, calm frequency that seemed to travel through the marble floor and up into the bones of everyone present. "Is this the standard welcome for all your guests?" The question was simple, direct, yet it landed with the weight of an accusation. A young waiter, passing by with a tray of shimmering champagne flutes, stopped dead in his tracks. The glasses trembled, their delicate ringing the only sound in the vast echoing silence. At a nearby table, a man with a bloated, florid face leaned into his companion and muttered, his voice a conspiratorial rasp. "She's probably looking for a handout. She looks completely out of place." The words were meant to be a private poison, but in the tomb-like quiet of the room, they echoed like a public proclamation. Then, the manager arrived. He moved with the slick, practiced urgency of a man summoned by the scent of trouble. His name tag read, Mr. Davies. His jaw was a tight knot of corporate anxiety, his command short and clipped. He didn't address the woman in crimson directly. He spoke about her, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been misplaced. "If she cannot produce a valid invitation, escort her out. We don't waste prime seating on vagrants and imposters." Emboldened by her superior's decree, Tiffany's smirk bloomed into a triumphant sneer. She tossed the menu onto the empty table with a contemptuous slap that cracked the silence. "Go on, then," she challenged, her voice dripping with derision. "Show us. Prove you belong here." A ripple of nervous, brittle laughter passed through some of the guests. It was the sound of discomfort turning into cruel entertainment. Still, the woman in crimson did not move. Her calm was no longer just poise. It was a form of pressure, a silent force that was beginning to unsettle the room more than any shouting match ever could. She reached into her small, unbranded clutch with a steadiness that was unnerving. Her fingers found her phone, her movements fluid and unhurried, her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto Mr. Davies. "Log this," she said, her voice still impossibly level. "Protocol 7Y, Procurement Division." Tiffany blinked, the smirk faltering for the first time. The manager's brow furrowed in confusion. Guests exchanged baffled glances. Protocol? Procurement? What did those words even mean in this context? The woman rose to her full height. The crimson of her dress seemed to deepen under the chandeliers, catching the light like embers on stone. Her voice, when she spoke again, had shed its quiet calm. It was now even, sharp, and absolutely unforgiving. "For the record, my name is Alistair, and for the past 12 years, I have been the sole logistics and procurement supplier this corporation has depended on. And tonight, you told the wrong woman that she doesn't belong." A collective gasp swept through the dining room. It was a sound of dawning, horrified recognition. Someone whispered her name. "Alistair," and the whisper ignited like wildfire, jumping from table to table. The nervous laughter died instantly. It was replaced by a wave of thick, crawling shame. She lifted her phone one last time, a judge holding her gavel. Her final command was delivered with the surgical precision of a CEO who had just made a decision worth billions. "Terminate the $4.2 billion global logistics contract, effective immediately." Tiffany's face went the color of ash. Mr. Davies' mouth opened and closed, but only a dry, stuttering gasp came out. The entire room, which had moments ago been a theater of mockery, was now a wax museum of stunned, silent horror. And she, calm, composed, untouchable, turned and walked away, leaving far more than a cancelled deal in her wake. She left irrefutable proof that dignity, once denied, often returns with the force of a tidal wave, because her silence had never been surrender. It was the coiled, patient power of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That stillness she possessed, that unnerving calm in the face of such blatant hostility, wasn't born in that dining room. It was a fortress she had built brick by painful brick over decades of silent endurance, a shield forged in the fires of 1,000 smaller humiliations. Her mind flickered back, a reel of old, painful film projecting onto the walls of the present moment. She was 16, standing in the opulent lobby of a grand hotel in Atlanta, her Sunday best pressed to a perfect crisp, her heart fluttering with the pride of a teenager being treated to her first fancy dinner. Her parents were running late, caught in traffic, and she had waited quietly near the entrance, hands folded, offering a polite smile to the guests who swept past in clouds of perfume and privilege. Then, a clerk with a face like pinched granite had approached her. The woman's voice was colder than the blast of the air conditioning. "This area is for registered guests only. You need to wait for your party outside on the sidewalk." Alistair had tried to explain. Her family had a reservation. They were on their way. But the clerk's eyes were deaf. She didn't see a guest. She saw a problem. A security guard materialized, a silent, imposing figure who didn't ask questions. He was there to escort. They led her through the revolving doors and onto the humid Atlanta pavement, as if she were a piece of trash being taken out. People stared. A boy her age laughed. The burn of shame in her throat was so hot she thought she might choke on it, but she swallowed it down. She stood on that sidewalk for 47 minutes, her pride bleeding out onto the concrete, fighting back tears that threatened to betray her. That humiliation never left her. It didn't shrink her. It sharpened her. Standing there, she made a silent, ferocious vow. One day I will build empires, and in my empires no one will ever be made to feel like they are waiting on the sidewalk. At 16 years old, under the indifferent gaze of a 5-star hotel, she began drafting the foundational rules of her future. Years later, another memory surfaced, just as sharp. San Francisco, she was 29, a rising star at a tech conference. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, professional, powerful, but understated. At the VIP check-in, the attendant had looked from her ID to her face, then back to the ID. "This can't be you," he'd stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "We're going to need to see some additional verification." She provided her corporate credit card, then her driver's license. Still, they made her stand aside. She waited for nearly 2 hours while 3 white men, whose names she knew were junior to hers, walked past her with nothing more than a nod and a smile from the staff. That night, alone in her hotel room, she didn't cry. She rewrote her company's policy drafts, embedding zero-tolerance clauses for any form of profiling or baseless suspicion. She would build systems that were better than the people who ran them. These flashbacks weren't just memories. They were battle scars. They were patterns of disrespect she had studied, analyzed, and learned from. And tonight, here in the Pinnacle Club, the pattern had repeated itself. The same tone of dismissal, the same arrogant assumption, the same verdict delivered without evidence. Only now she wasn't a 16-year-old girl on a sidewalk. She wasn't a 29-year-old professional being questioned. She was the CEO of a global powerhouse, with the ability to create or destroy fortunes with a single command. Tiffany, the hostess, didn't see that history. Mr. Davies, the manager, didn't see the weight of those decades behind Alistair's steady, unblinking eyes. To them, she was an anomaly, a disruption in their carefully curated world of privilege. But to her, this moment was the culmination of a lifetime of work. Her hand brushed the phone on the table, and the memories receded, bleeding back into the tense silence of the present. The marble floor gleamed. The air in the room was tight, charged, and ready to snap. Tiffany straightened her blazer, her confidence still tragically intact. "Your name is not on our reservation list. I suggest you leave before I'm forced to call security." Alistair lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. Her voice was calm, but every word landed like a steel beam. "Do not mistake my silence for weakness. It is patience, and I assure you patience has its limits." The manager scoffed, utterly oblivious to the chasm opening up at his feet. Guests shifted again, a palpable sense that this was no longer a simple seating dispute. This was a reckoning. Phones were now angled more obviously, their small red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes in the dim light. And Alistair sat back, letting the full weight of her past and the undeniable power of her present finally align. The next words spoken would not just change the atmosphere, they would change the future of everyone in that room. The weight of her words, patience has its limits, hung in the air, thick and ominous. But silence, especially a hostile one, never holds forever. The first crack in the dam of arrogance came from the most unexpected corner of the room. It was the young waiter, Leo. He couldn't have been more than 20. He carefully set his trembling silver tray of champagne flutes down on a nearby sideboard, the clinking of the glasses sounding like an alarm bell in the tense quiet. He took a hesitant step forward. His voice shook, but it was clear enough to carry. I saw her name," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward Mr. Davies. "It's in the system, Alistair. She has a reservation. She's supposed to be here." A collective intake of breath rippled across the tables. Mr. Davies snapped his head towards the young man, his face contorting in fury. "Stay in your place, boy! This does not concern you!" But Leo didn't retreat. Some hidden well of courage had been tapped. His eyes flickered from his furious manager to Ms. Alistair, then to the dozen or so guests who now had their phones raised, recording every second. A woman 2 seats away, draped in diamonds, whispered sharply to her husband, "Richard, this is being recorded. This is going to be everywhere." Her own phone was angled perfectly, its red light blinking with undeniable intent. She was not alone. 6 other screens glowed, no longer subtle but held up boldly. One guest, a man in a navy suit named Marcus, leaned into his phone's camera, whispering to a live stream audience he was cultivating. "For those of you just joining, we are at an exclusive executive dinner at the Pinnacle in Chicago, and you are about to witness something incredibly ugly happen in real time." A cascade of comments began to flood his screen, an invisible digital army roaring its outrage from thousands of miles away. Tiffany stiffened, a flicker of panic in her eyes as she finally realized this private humiliation was becoming a very public spectacle. She hissed at the woman with the diamonds, "Put that phone down immediately." The woman simply stared back at her and did not move. Ms. Alistair didn't need to do a thing. The room was finally beginning to move for her. Another voice sliced through the tension. It belonged to a silver-haired woman at the far end of the table, Mrs. Gable, a string of heavy pearls at her neck. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and unflinching. "I cannot believe what I am witnessing. Are we seriously still doing this in the year 2025? Mr. Davies bristled. "Madam, with all due respect, this is a private matter." She waved him off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "No, enough. I've seen this exact brand of arrogant prejudice my entire life, and I will not sit here and watch it happen in silence one more time." The room was shifting. A dam of complicit silence had broken. Those who had been smirking were now looking down at their plates. Those who had been staring at their plates were now looking up, emboldened. Whispers of, "This is wrong," and "You can't treat her like that," grew into audible murmurs of protest. The tension had finally cracked wide open. What had begun as a singular, vicious insult was now metastasizing into a collective moral crisis. Tiffany, cornered and desperate, tried to regain control by escalating. "She's lying! This is fraud! People like her!" She stopped short, the words catching in her throat as she looked around and saw not a room of allies, but a jury of accusers, every single one of them pointing a lens directly at her, recording, documenting. Mr. Davies's voice snapped like a whip, a desperate bid to reassert dominance. "All of you, stop filming! This is private property!" But even he knew the truth. Once a story like this escapes into the digital world, there is no calling it back. It belongs to everyone. Ms. Alistair finally moved. She rose from her chair, her crimson dress flowing around her. She was as calm as ever, her gaze steady and penetrating. "Do you see?" she asked, her voice cutting cleanly across the rising chaos. When the silence of the complicit ends, the truth finally has room to breathe. For the first time that night, applause broke the stillness. It wasn't thunderous, not yet. But it was a start. It was the sound of arrogance beginning to fracture, and in that moment, the entire room had chosen a side. The fragile applause died down, replaced by a tense, expectant murmur, but the damage was irreversible. The authority of Tiffany and Mr. Davies had been publicly challenged, and it had cracked. They knew it. Yet, blinded by a pride that had metastasized into pure desperation, they pushed even harder. Mr. Davies's face was a blotchy, crimson mask of fury. He slammed his palm against the back of an empty chair, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough of this circus!" he barked, his voice straining to project a command he no longer possessed. "If she refuses to leave, I will call the police myself." Tiffany, taking his rage as a final lifeline, lunged forward. "She doesn't have the credentials. She doesn't belong here, and if no one in this room has the backbone to remove her, I will." Before anyone could react, the hostess did something unthinkable. She reached for the small clutch resting on the table beside Ms. Allister. She snatched it up, holding it aloft like a piece of damning evidence. "Let's just see what's inside this thing. If you're truly invited, you won't mind, will you?" A wave of shocked gasps swept through the hall. Mrs. Gable, the woman with the pearls, shouted, "That is assault! That is theft!" But Tiffany, now operating on pure, unhinged adrenaline, ignored her, fumbling with the clasp. Allister did not lunge. She did not scream. She simply folded her hands in front of her, her eyes locking onto the hostess with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. "You will regret that more than anything you have ever done." This is getting intense, isn't it? If you're on the edge of your seat right now, do me a favor and smash that like button. Let the algorithm know that stories of justice and consequence need to be seen and heard by everyone. Now, let's get back to the storm she is about to unleash. "Mr. Orm," Davies grabbed the clutch from Tiffany's trembling hands, plunging his hand inside and pulling out a sleek, black carbon fiber card and a heavy, gold-embossed invitation. He held them up like trophies won in battle. "Fake," he sneered, his voice ringing with a false, desperate triumph. "These cheap tricks are as old as time. You think we can't spot a counterfeit?" The absurdity of his declaration was lost on him. Phones tilted higher, their lenses capturing every detail of his delusion. Leo, the young waiter, just shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, that's the corporate crest," he whispered, horrified. "That's the real invitation." But Davies's voice rose, a frantic attempt to drown out the truth. "She is a fraud, an opportunist. People like her try to sneak into places like this all the time, hoping for a free meal or a chance to steal from our real guests. I will not let it happen on my watch." The venom in his voice was palpable, and the phrase, "people like her," hung in the air like toxic smoke. Mrs. Gable gasped, covering her mouth in disgust. The murmurs of the guests were turning into open outrage. Tiffany, doubling down on their shared madness, stepped closer to Ms. Allister, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Stand up! Leave this room right now or I will have you physically dragged out myself." She gestured wildly to two other waiters standing by the wall, trying to summon them like personal guards. But they didn't move. Their eyes flicked from the legion of raised phones back to the unshakable woman in crimson. They were not moving. Ms. Allister rose slowly, her crimson dress catching the light with a regal shimmer. She stood taller than the insult, taller than the threat, taller than their combined ignorance. "This is the last time," she said evenly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "that you will ever touch what is mine." Davies made one last, fatal attempt to control the narrative. He held up the black carbon fiber card between two fingers. "You call this proof? It's a worthless piece of plastic." He tossed it contemptuously onto the table, where it landed with a soft, final slap against the white linen. "You are finished here." Every phone lens caught the card. Every guest saw it. The woman in crimson bent slightly at the waist. She picked up the card, holding it steady between her fingers. Her gaze swept the room, calm, unwavering, and utterly unstoppable. You think this card proves nothing? She asked quietly. In truth, it proves everything. The room held its breath, leaning in as one. The moment had finally reached its breaking point. One more push, and the entire structure of their arrogant world would collapse. And she was ready to push. The room was a vacuum, every ounce of air seemingly sucked out by the sheer, unbearable tension. Phones hovered like a constellation of glowing eyes, each one a silent witness, each one capturing the final, desperate insults of the manager and the hostess. They had gambled everything on their prejudice, and the ground beneath their feet was cracking apart. The woman in crimson, Ms. Allister, stood tall, the black card held delicately between her fingers. She let the silence stretch for one last, excruciating heartbeat, then placed the card gently back into her clutch. Her hand moved with deliberate, unhurried grace as she lifted her phone once more. "Activate Protocol 7, she said, her voice calm but resonant, echoing in the tomb-like quiet. "Begin full vocal verification and notify the entire procurement division. Immediately." The words landed like a thunderclap. Guests exchanged wide-eyed, confused glances. Mr. Davies attempted a laugh, but it came out as a strangled bark. "What is this pathetic performance? No protocol can save you now." She ignored him completely. Into the phone, she added, "Mark this timestamp. I want a full, unedited transcript of every word spoken by the management in this room for the last 10 minutes. On the other end of the line, a crisp, professional voice replied, clear and loud enough for the nearest tables to hear distinctly. "Acknowledged, Ms. Allister. Protocol 7 activated. Vocal logging initiated. The board is being notified." A visible ripple went through the room. Leo, the waiter, exhaled a sharp, shaky breath, as if a truth he had only suspected had just been confirmed in steel. Mrs. Gable leaned closer to another guest, whispering with grim satisfaction, "Do you hear that? She's not bluffing. This is real." Tiffany tried to claw back some ground, her voice brittle with a confidence she no longer felt. "Anyone can stage a phone call. Anyone can pretend to have authority." She turned to the guests, her expression pleading, desperate. "She is lying to all of you. She's a nobody. Miss..." Allister's eyes met hers, steady as ancient stone. "Silence is not nobody. Silence is a decision, and tonight, that decision ends." Mr. Davis's last shred of patience snapped. "Enough!" he roared, waving frantically at the waiters by the wall. "Remove her! Get her out of my dining room now!" But they remained frozen, statues of defiance. One of them subtly shook his head. The other kept his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the floor. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted. The staff was no longer loyal to him. The guests were no longer on his side. Murmurs of dissent were now clear, declarative statements. "You can't throw her out. She has every right to be here. This has gone way too far." Miss Allister lowered her phone slightly, her tone still even, still measured, but now carrying the weight of impending doom. "For 12 years, this corporation has relied on a single, exclusive logistics partner. For 12 years, I have been that partner. Tonight, you decided I didn't belong. Consider this the final mistake your careers will ever allow you to make." Gasps shivered through the room. The whispered name, Allister, was now spoken with certainty. Recognition was spreading. Marcus, the man in the navy suit, leaned urgently toward his phone's camera, whispering to his thousands of viewers, "She's someone important. I think she's the CEO of GLS. This is about to explode." Tiffany stepped forward, raw fury breaking through her mask of panic. "You can't intimidate us with empty threats and fake phone calls." She slammed her hand on the table. "Show us real proof or get out." Ms. Allister turned her gaze to her phone one last time. Initiate contract review. Prepare the immediate termination order for the entire global account. The voice on the other end responded swiftly, its tone firm and unyielding. Understood. The $4.2 billion contract termination sequence is armed and ready. Awaiting your final confirmation, Ms. Allister. Every single guest heard it. The words vibrated in the air. Undeniable. Unstoppable. Real. Mr. Davies's smirk finally shattered. His eyes darted wildly toward the forest of phones recording his downfall. Tiffany went so pale she looked translucent, her confidence draining away like blood from a fatal wound. And the woman in the crimson dress stood perfectly still, her calm now the most terrifying and powerful force in the room. The first strike had landed. The counterattack had begun. The room felt as if it had been split in two. Every second stretched into an eternity, suspended between the manager's pathetic denial and the onrushing tidal wave of revelation. Phones were held higher. Guests leaned forward, their bodies tense. The air pulsed with the raw electricity of a truth about to be unleashed. Mr. Davies straightened his jacket, a pathetic, reflexive attempt to salvage a shred of his dignity. Enough of this nonsense. Protocols, staged phone calls. These are nothing but cheap parlor tricks. You have wasted enough of our time. Security will escort you out. But the words trembled as they left his mouth. For the first time, his authority didn't just sound thin. It sounded non-existent. Ms. Allister lifted her gaze from her phone, and her eyes swept the room. She did not need to shout. Her calm carried farther and hit harder than any rage ever could. For over a decade, she began, her voice precise and cutting, your parent corporation has relied on a single supplier to sustain its global logistics. The trucks that move your products, the warehouses that store them, the very supply chain that allows you to hold these dinners, these conferences, these very meals you are eating tonight. That supplier is my company. A wave of murmurs crashed through the hall. Guests looked at each other, their eyes wide, the name tumbling from their lips now. Global Logistics Solutions, GLS. I have personally signed every renewal that your board has celebrated, she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. I have negotiated every rate that your executives have bragged about. And tonight, at your most exclusive executive dinner, you decided I didn't belong. Mrs. Gable, at the far end of the table, whispered in an almost reverent tone. It is her. I read about her in Forbes. She's the founder. She built it from nothing. Recognition spread like fire on dry grass. Faces that had held smirks of amusement now twisted into masks of horror. The man in the navy suit, Marcus, leaned toward his live stream, his voice an urgent, excited whisper. You are watching this live. This isn't just a supplier. She's the CEO. She's the backbone of their entire operation. His live chat feed exploded, a frantic waterfall of disbelief and outrage. Tiffany took a stumbling step backward, the color completely draining from her face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She clutched the back of a chair as if the room itself were tilting violently beneath her feet. Mr. Davies tried one last, desperate laugh. It was a brittle, empty, horrifying sound. Impossible. If you were truly who you claim to be, you wouldn't come dressed like... He stopped himself, the insult dying on his lips as he realized, far too late, that his prejudice had just signed his death warrant. The woman in orange did not flinch. Power doesn't need sequins. It doesn't need brand names. Power is patience, and tonight, my patience has ended. Gasps morphed into scattered applause, which then began to build. A few guests, led by Mrs. Gable, rose to their feet, clapping in open defiance of the management that had shamed them all. Phones flashed, capturing the electrifying transformation of the room from a place of humiliation to a court of judgment. Mr. Davies's face was now a ghastly shade of pale gray. His authority had not just been challenged, it had been publicly executed. He turned to Tiffany, his voice cracking. You said she was lying." But the hostess was already shaking her head, unable to meet his eyes, her earlier bravado having dissolved into a visible, trembling panic. The woman in the crimson dress raised her phone one final time, her voice ringing out with absolute finality. Confirm the immediate termination of the $4.2 billion global logistics contract." The crisp voice on the line answered instantly. "Confirmed, Ms. Allister. Contract terminated, effective immediately." A hush rolled over the room, heavier and more profound than any silence that had come before. This was no longer a threat. It was a fact. A multi-billion-dollar pillar of their corporation had just been turned to dust. Mr. Davies staggered backward and collapsed into his chair, staring at nothing. Tiffany clutched the menu in her hand like it was a shield, her knuckles bone-white. And in the center of the storm she had created, the CEO stood untouched, her truth now as undeniable as the financial ruin she had just unleashed. The declaration landed like a hammer blow. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the only sound was the faint, electric hum of the chandeliers. Then, the room didn't erupt in applause. It erupted in chaos. Mr. Davies slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the phone in her hand, as if it were a loaded gun. His face, once flushed with arrogant authority, had drained to a sickly ashen gray. He muttered under his breath, his words fractured and hollow. "This can't be happening. No, not here. Not tonight." Tiffany stood frozen beside him, still clutching the menu she had slammed down what felt like a lifetime ago. Her fingers trembled so violently that the heavy paper shook with an audible rattle. The smug, condescending curve of her lips was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed, primal terror of someone watching the ground crumble away beneath her feet. Guests no longer whispered. They spoke openly, their voices sharp with a mixture of outrage and gleeful shock. "She owns the whole contract." "I told you I recognized her." Imagine the sheer arrogance telling her she didn't belong. The phones were held even higher now, their cameras no longer shy or surreptitious. Marcus's live stream audience had swelled into the tens of thousands, a massive, invisible crowd feeding on the frenzy in the room. Every second was being broadcast. Every breath was being documented for eternity. Leo, the young waiter who had first spoken up, stood taller, emboldened by the vindication. "I saw her name in the system," he said, his voice carrying further this time, amplified by the truth. "She was always supposed to be here." Gable pushed her chair back with a decisive, scraping sound against the marble floor. She rose to her feet, her pearls catching the light. "I will not sit at this table for one more second," she announced, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had seen decades of history repeat itself and had finally decided to stop watching and start acting. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Chairs shifted. Guests leaned forward, some applauding softly, others shaking their heads in disgust at the staff who had so spectacularly self-destructed. Mr. Davies tried one last, pathetic attempt to reclaim the narrative, his voice quivering but desperate. "Don't be fooled by this. This theatrics. She can't just cancel a contract of that size in the middle of dinner." But the words sounded hollow, absurd. At that exact moment, Ms. Allister's phone chimed with a notification, an automated email confirmation of the termination order. She glanced at it, then looked back at him. Her silence was a more powerful answer than any argument could ever be. Tiffany finally dropped the menu. The sound of it slapping against the floor was as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. Her composure had not just cracked, It had shattered into a million pieces. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice breaking. Nobody told me who she was. Ms. Allister's gaze did not waver. You didn't need to know who I was. Respect is not a reward for recognition. It is the baseline price of admission for human interaction. The line cut through the room like lightning. Gasps turned into applause, louder this time, a wave of sound echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. Mr. Davies buried his face in his hands. The hostess stood paralyzed, trapped in the merciless glare of 100 staring eyes and 1,000 unseen recording lenses. Around them, the atmosphere had been irrevocably transformed. Where moments before she had been an isolated target, now Ms. Allister stood at the center of a circle of allies, some clapping, some filming, all of them bearing witness. The tide had not just turned. It had become a tsunami, and the shame was no longer hers to carry. The air in the dining hall was now electric, thick with judgment and heavy with a sense of brutal, instantaneous justice. Every phone, every pair of eyes, remained locked on the woman in crimson. She did not rush the moment. She let the silence build again, let the anticipation of her next move sharpen to a razor's edge. Then, she lifted her phone one final time. Confirm termination and send immediate notification to all corporate partners, she said clearly, her voice devoid of emotion. Effective tonight, this venue and its senior management are permanently blacklisted from all future events and contracts. No appeals, no second chances. The voice on the line answered without a flicker of hesitation. Acknowledged, contract terminated, access revoked, access. Blacklist notification has been sent to all global partners. The words rippled outward like a detonation. Guests gasped, some audibly sucking in their breath. Marcus, the man in the navy suit, turned his live stream camera toward himself, his eyes wide with disbelief. You all just heard that. A $4.2 billion contract. Gone. In real time. This is insane. His live chat exploded, a chaotic frenzy of comments where disbelief collided with fierce satisfaction. Mr. Davies staggered to his feet. You can't do this, he shouted, though his voice cracked under the weight of its own weakness. You don't have that kind of unilateral power? But even as he spoke, his own phone began to buzz violently on the table. He snatched it up, his eyes scanning the screen. His shoulders slumped. The last vestiges of blood drained from his face. It was real. The official cancellation notice had already arrived. The hostess's phone vibrated next. She fumbled to silence it, but not before the guests at the nearest table caught a clear glimpse of the message preview on her screen. Subject: Notice of immediate termination. Her mouth opened, a silent, desperate scream, but no words came out. Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her voice carrying across the silent hall. You tried to strip her of her dignity. Instead, you stripped yourselves of your careers, your reputations, of everything that mattered. Applause broke out again, stronger and more unified this time. It started with a few tables, then spread until the entire hall echoed with the sound of clapping hands and voices raised in approval. Some guests were standing now, others were cheering, all of it directed at the woman they had been told did not belong. Ms. Allister lowered her phone, her expression steady, unshaken, and unreadable. She looked directly at the broken man in the chair. For 12 years, I gave this company my loyalty, my partnership, and my patience. Tonight, you offered me none of those things in return, so now you have nothing. Her words cut deeper than any shout ever could. Mr. Davies's knees seemed to buckle. He dropped back into his chair, his gaze fixed on the polished floor as though it might mercifully swallow him whole. The hostess made one last, desperate, pitiful attempt. Please, I didn't know. If I had just realized who you were. Ms. Allister's gaze pinned her in place. That is the entire point. You shouldn't need to know who I am to offer me basic human respect. You didn't fail a test of recognition. You failed a test of character, and now you will answer for that failure. The phones caught every syllable, every tear that now trembled in the hostess's eyes, every twitch of utter defeat in the manager's clenched hands. Around the room, the applause swelled again, louder, firmer, no longer scattered, but a unified roar. The guests were no longer just clapping for her victory. They were clapping against the ugliness they had been forced to witness. It was a final, thunderous rejection of arrogance, prejudice, and hate. Ms. Allister stood perfectly still, letting the storm play out around her. She didn't need to add another word. The punishment was absolute. The contract was gone. The authority of her accusers had completely collapsed in the full view of the very people they had tried so desperately to impress. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with quiet, surgical, and irreversible precision. The applause finally ebbed, fading into a heavy, profound silence. But this silence was different. It no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them. The ones who had mocked her, the ones who had tried to expel her, the ones who were now drowning in the consequences. Mr. Davies slumped forward, his elbows digging into the fine linen, his hands tangled in his hair, as if he were trying to physically keep his head from exploding. His phone continued to buzz relentlessly on the table, each vibration a cruel electronic torment, a reminder of collapsing partnerships, of furious board members demanding explanations, of a career that had been publicly and spectacularly immolated. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes were wet with the tears of a man utterly undone in front of his peers. Tiffany stood rigid against the wall, as if the sheer force of her will could hold her fragmenting world together. Her hands shook violently, clutching the back of a chair as if it were a lifeline in a shipwreck. The menu she had so arrogantly thrown to the floor earlier still lay there, a discarded emblem of her fatal pride. She couldn't bend down to pick it up. Her knees wouldn't allow it. She was a statue of shame, trapped in the unblinking glare of dozens of phones that were still recording her disgrace. Leo, the young waiter, stood rooted to his spot, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had defended her name before the truth was ever known, and now his simple act of courage seemed almost prophetic. His manager had tried to silence him, but he had been vindicated. Still, his face was flushed with the sheer, terrifying enormity of what had just unfolded. He whispered to himself, as if trying to convince his own spirit that it was real. I was right. Across the room, Mrs. Gable sat tall, her pearls glowing faintly in the dim light. She looked at the hostess and shook her head slowly, a deep disappointment etched into every line of her face. History only repeats itself, she said, her voice firm, audible enough for the entire room to hear, because people consistently choose arrogance over dignity. The phones kept recording. Marcus, the man in the Navy suit, was still live streaming. He panned his camera slowly across the scene of devastation. Look at them, he whispered to his unseen audience. The manager is broken, the hostess is a ghost, the staff is silent. And she, the woman they tried to humiliate, she is the only one left standing tall. His viewers flooded the feed with comments, a torrent of outrage, pride, and solidarity. The younger guests who had smirked earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their amusement having long since curdled into deep unease. Some whispered apologies to no one in particular. Others simply bowed their heads, unable to meet her gaze. Miss Allister did not move. She stood like a pillar, steady and immovable, watching the storm of shame roll across the people who had dared to try and strip her of her humanity. Her presence alone was judgment enough. The manager finally lifted his head, his voice broken and pleading. "Please, you can't end it like this. Give us a chance to make it right." She did not answer him. She did not need to. The silence that followed was heavier and more final than any refusal. The hostess's voice cracked into the stillness. I was only doing my job, But the pathetic excuse fell flat, mocked by the echo of her own vicious words. "We don't seat your kind in the main hall." Every guest remembered. Every phone had captured it. There was no escape. The room itself seemed to recoil from her. She was no longer just a hostess. She was the face of disgrace, a cautionary tale written in the bright, burning neon of her own failure. The applause began one last time. Not for the manager, not for the hostess, but for the woman in crimson who had endured, who had risen, and who had single-handedly turned the tide. And for the first time that evening, the entire room finally understood where the true power had always been. The room had reoriented itself entirely. No one looked at the manager anymore. No one waited for the hostess to speak. Every eye was locked on the woman in the crimson dress, the woman who had carried herself through the crucible of insult and emerged not just victorious, but transcendent. She closed her clutch with a soft, final click, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to leave. Around her, the applause swelled again, not scattered this time, but unified, loud and relentless. It was a chorus of acknowledgement, a sound that carried justice in its very rhythm. And yet she did not bask in it. She simply stood, collected, and let the sound pass over her like wind through a flame. The hostess pressed herself against the wall, her eyes downcast, as if hoping the marble might absorb her into itself. The manager sat hollowed out, his phone still buzzing with the sounds of his own ruin. None of it mattered to her anymore. Their power was gone, stripped bare in front of everyone they had sought to impress. Ms. Allister walked slowly toward the exit. Every step was measured, steady, the hem of her crimson dress brushing against the polished floor like a final, fiery brush stroke. Cameras followed her every move, but she never turned to pose. Her posture was her statement. Her silence was her speech. At the doorway, she paused one last time. She turned back, her gaze sweeping the room, not to savor her victory, but to deliver the final, indelible truth. "Power is not in what you take from others," she said, her voice calm and clear. "It is in what you refuse to surrender. Tonight, I refuse to surrender my dignity. You failed not because you didn't recognize me. You failed because you didn't recognize a human being standing in front of you, and that is a debt no contract can ever repay." The words lingered in the air long after her footsteps had carried her beyond the hall. Guests remained in their seats, stunned into silence, some still applauding even as the doors swung shut behind her. The phones kept recording, but what they had captured was more than just a story. It was a reckoning. In the quiet that followed, one truth settled over the ruined room like a verdict. She had been told she didn't belong, and she had answered by proving, beyond any doubt, that she owned the very ground they stood on. The woman in the crimson dress was gone, but her presence filled every corner of the room, and would for a very, very long time. Her story is a testament to the power of holding your ground, of knowing your worth when the world tries to tell you that you have none. What's a moment in your life when you refused to let someone diminish you? Share your story in the comments below. Let's create a community of strength right here. And please don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss another story that matters. Thank you for being here, and for being a witness.